After that typically modest video, we'll have our next discussion, which I'm very excited about, to bring aboard Ty Cobb, the director of HRC Global, and Amanda Simpson, formerly of the United States Department of Defense. You may have heard of that organization. And actually recently of a new affiliation that she might tell us about today. Thanks both of you for coming. Amanda, you could start by telling us your new gig if you like.
Well, we could. I mean, okay, so I was with the Department of Defense until I was involuntarily separated a little over 16 months ago. Seems that the current administration no longer had need of my skills, which I jokingly think of because they still haven't figured out how to replace me yet.
And also quite a few other people.
And quite a few other people. It's not like I was singled out. They asked us all to leave. But as of, well, I guess I will start on Tuesday morning, but agreed to yesterday, I will be the Vice President for Research and Technology at Airbus. So.
Great. And yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
You were right here on this stage a year ago.
It was.
Why don't you tell us, and I should say, I think, in kicking this off, the title of this is The New Frontiers of Discrimination. Oh, and I'm supposed to remind you as well, do vote in the app on this poll question. Has the Me Too movement paid enough attention to LGBT discrimination? And I will announce the results at the end of this session. The New Frontiers of Discrimination, the title for this session, does imply that we've conquered the old frontiers. What can you tell us about the last year, since you were last here?
So I was sitting here a year ago, and we were all talking happy about how at the end of June of 2016, the Department of Defense repealed their prohibition on open transgender service. And I sat here, we were talking about it, we thought it was great, and that's where we were. And come a month or so after I was here came the tweet, right? The tweet that open transgender service in any kind in the United States military is not acceptable. And people call it the ban, I call it the purge, because it is indeed telling our service members that regardless of how much time, how much effort, their service is no longer wanted. And I know dozens of service members in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard that have been serving with distinction for, in some cases, decades. And now they are fearful on whether or not they will make it to retirement, whether their spouses and their families will be cared for, whether they will be making a living at any moment. Thankfully, the courts have been holding off implementation of the purge, and hopefully that'll last long enough for us to, the courts either to rule that it's unconstitutional or that we have an administration that repeals that guidance. Other things that have been happening, just recently, the State Department, which historically for openly gay foreign service officers, would not assign them to countries where their safety was at risk, has within the last several weeks reversed that policy and told foreign service members, you will go where you're assigned regardless. So we're seeing some shifts. Here we thought we had everything handled, and we're fighting some old battles all over again.
Right, and you wanted to address that too, Ty, right? We're going backwards in a few places.
Correct. I think that first, thank you for putting this conversation together, and it's kind of amazing to get to do this with Amanda. We've known each other for years, and she really represented us well at the Department of Defense, and it's exciting to hear about your new job and that you use opportunities like this to talk about inclusion whenever you can. And it means a lot to us at HRC, and it's also, we would have loved to be able to tell Reverend Barber as well just how much it meant to us as a community when he stood up beside us in North Carolina when opposing HB2, because that was such a critical moment for the movement, and the work across movements was never more important. It was so great to have him there. And I think that what Amanda's talking about is true. We have seen so much progress here in the United States, tremendous amount of progress, and at the same time now we're seeing parts of that disappear, go away, move backwards. It's heartbreaking. Acknowledging the fact that with a tweet, the President of the United States sent a message about the value of trans people in this country. Not just the military, just that there's something that's inherently wrong with you, that you cannot serve in the military. And that's a hugely disappointing and horrific message to come from the President of the United States. And we're so excited to be part of a case. Lambda Legal is representing us, actually challenging the Twitter ban, as we like to call it. And it's just such an important to see these rollbacks that are happening. It also reminds me, I woke up this morning to see pictures from our team at HRC. Last night we projected statistics about LGBTQ youth on the side of the Department of Education. We released a study, the largest study of LGBTQ youth around this country last week, and we wanted to send a message to Betsy DeVos and the Department of Education that LGBTQ youth are still having a really tough time in this country. Incredible amounts of bullying, incredibly negative message from leaders throughout both national and local government. And so it was an incredibly important thing to do because one of the first things Secretary DeVos did was roll back protections for trans students in school within months after this administration started. But the main reason I'm even...
Well, and may I hope to interject here, and because of that rollback, the Gavin Grimm case did not make it to the Supreme Court. And just 2 days ago, the district court has reaffirmed that case, and it will continue to move forward. And
say a little bit more about that case.
So the Gavin Grimm case, he was in high school in southwestern Virginia, and he transitioned female to male, and his school was doing fine until several parents started to complain, and then the school district decided that he should not have access to a male bathroom. And so lawsuits ensued, and so the county was, the school district was once again set back just, I think, on Tuesday, and the case is now proceeding forward again. So we have setbacks, we're continuing to move forward. We saw, you're gonna follow up on this, we saw an attempt in Anchorage, Alaska to repeal an ordinance that gave issue or brought non-discrimination policy to the city of Anchorage. There was a ballot measure to repeal that non-discrimination ordinance. It went to the public and it was defeated by a narrow margin, but still,
still defeated.
Still, it was defeated. But then we can talk about what happened in Oklahoma and Kansas this month.
Yeah, I mean, at the state level, we're under attack as well. Kansas and Oklahoma have moved legislations forward that really targets the community. I think one of the things we can talk about that's positive right now is I think there is a degree of working across movements more than I've ever seen before, and more than many people have seen before, and an energy behind that that's incredible. Also, there's a trend across the United States of states really taking the step, moving forward and banning conversion therapy, something that has really hurt LGBT youth, something that's not based in science and has had a negative impact, but states are taking this on from coast to coast, and several bills have passed and been enacted this year on that topic.
Do you think there was an impetus for that from just the profile Pence gave it, kind of in a negative sense?
Well, I definitely think he put his stamp on supporting it, which gives someone, it brought more visibility to the issue, which is actually helpful in some ways, but it's allowed us to really talk about how harmful this practice is and how actually present it still is in our country, that kids are referred to therapists that use this practice. And they hear the methods and the terminology and the way this is conducted from leaders within their communities in ways that is really hurtful.
Right. And so do you see some other green shoots, Amanda, as well? I mean, there is a little bit of this silver lining, right, of that he talked about there's a kind of a galvanizing.
Right.
Energy,
so
right?
we saw an attempt in California to put a ballot measure on that would repeal the state of California's issues regarding transgender students. And that, even though they turned in, I loved it, twice as many signatures as required, more than half of those signatures were found to be invalid, and thus the ballot measure was disqualified. But we do have a ballot measure doing pretty much the same thing coming up that has made the ballot in Massachusetts, and will be on the ballot in, I think it's November, or is it coming up in June? But it's soon, and these are these are attempts to step backwards. So we're gonna see what the public feels. But I think we've seen that whether it would be the tweet and the way the country has responded, the public has come behind our service members, our heroes, and said, you can't just dismiss them with 128 characters times 3, because he ran long. That's not the right way to lead. And I think it's galvanized the country to actually support that. So that has bled over to bathroom issues, to school issues. But things are still going on. Just this week, the administration rolled back protections for transgender prisoners with regards to how they are housed in prisons, federal prisons. They've recently rolled back coverage, or trying to help roll back coverage for health insurance. So I mean, there's things that are continuing. The fight is not over. We thought we had reached the summit, but it was a false summit, and we're going down the other side. We've got another summit to climb.
And you mentioned the bathroom bill, the North Carolina issue. I mean, we are sorry not to have Reverend Barber here today, but we know that he's been extremely active on these issues and very helpful, and it's brought out a segment of the faith community and made it more visible, and that's been helpful for some of these states that you're talking about, right?
Well, I think about Senate Bill 3 in Texas, which was effectively a bathroom bill, where the communities of faith and corporations stood up and told the House that this is the wrong way, and for Texas to proceed, and it did not make it to the governor's desk because the governor had said he would sign it. So we're seeing the influence of corporate America. We're seeing the influence of progressively minded religious affiliates as well that are standing up and saying, we're all the children of God, and that everyone should be treated fairly and equitably.
Ty, you, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I think you were...
No, go. I think that what it's reminding me is that some of the stuff Amanda was talking about is just how important it is that we have garnered so much corporate support and continue to want more to support the Equality Act, a piece of legislation at the federal level that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We still don't have those protections in this country. We rely on companies that are doing the right thing. We rely on some states, a patchwork of state laws that include sexual orientation and gender identity, but we still do not have federal protections for LGBTQ people in this country. And while we do not have a ringing endorsement or any endorsement from this administration behind that legislation, we do have a lot of companies, a lot of you who have signed on to be part of supporting that bill, and it's so incredibly important. And we'd love everyone that has not signed on to support that bill to actually join us, because a lot of these gaps can be covered with federal legislation if we can get that enacted.
Great. And what I wanted to ask you was, you also are, of course, looking at these issues beyond our borders, internationally. Can you talk to us about some of the key trends you're looking at globally on these issues?
Well, you helped me because I was trying to figure out how to pivot to the global conversation, so you did it for me.
Well, you have global in your title there with HRC Global, so I had to.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, I think that first, I'm glad we spent time acknowledging what's going on here in this country, because we really are seeing things move backwards in a lot of ways. And for you, all the folks here that know HRC, really our history and our roots have been in domestic advocacy for LGBT issues. That said, we've started to play a much larger role in working with our peers around the globe in the equality movements all over. from every region in the globe. And one of the things I would say is that while we are focused on what's going on in this country, I think we also have to not have blinders on about what's going on in the rest of the world. And a lot of you work at companies that are not just operating here in the United States, but have operations across borders and significant operations all over the world. And we're here talking about Trump's Twitter ban on trans folks serving in the military. And that's important, and we've got to keep talking about it. And I think that businesses have a role to play in that conversation and have played a role in that conversation. But we also have to recognize that in Indonesia, legislation was proposed this year to criminalize same-sex sexual activity. A very scary proposal that actually goes against trends of decriminalization. We've seen in India, the highest court has now asked the government to submit a brief on its position around criminalization in that country in the upcoming months. And that's important. India still has a criminalization statute. I see questioned or confused faces or surprised faces about that. And I mean, looking at some place like Brazil. Brazil last month had the 35th person, trans person, murdered in that country just last month for this year. Now, some of that's reflected here at home. We've had 28 trans women killed in this country this year, mostly trans women of color. But all of you and your corporations and the folks you work with have a role in the conversations about these things because all of these impact your employees. If you have employees in the United States and Indonesia and India or Brazil, this all affects your workplace. And so what I encourage everyone to do is while we're looking at what's going on in this country, and we rightly should, also be looking at what's going on for your LGBTQ employees in all of these other places.
You also, you had this poll about the polarization, looking at the polarization of opinions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, we were talking backstage, and something that came out recently that some of you may see is the Williams Institute, a great institution that does great research on LGBTQ folks, came out with the results of a study about 2 to 3 weeks ago that said some great news, that around the world, since 1980, acceptance of LGBTQ people has risen. Now, the thing that I think is interesting about that is the caveat to that is it has continually risen in places where there's greater levels of inclusion, and in countries where inclusion is weak, it's actually going down. And so a greater polarization about the environments people are in based on where they are in their journey. Everyone is not just going like this and up. There's actually a journey where people are going in different directions. And so as employers of folks around the globe, it's actually useful to know the nuance that every place the trajectory for LGBTQ people isn't the same. You're combating something very different in one country than you are in another, and to be somewhat engaged in understanding that the research is showing us that it's not always just going up, that some places it's going down, is helpful for businesses in making plans for what they're doing.
And what do you think what are a couple concrete things you think businesses can do in these countries? I mean, some of these countries are difficult to operate. I mean, I opened this up to both.
Well,
of
no,
you.
I mean, there's a couple of different observations, and I hate to always go back to the tweet, but what it does demonstrate is how important leadership is. We rely on our leadership, and we think that, okay, we've made progress, but who we bring in to lead our organizations, and I'm not just talking about governments, let's think about our corporations. Who leads the corporation is going to set the tone and the policy, and it can change like that, whether or not it's a full outright 180 flip, or we're just not going to enforce our policies, particularly when it becomes difficult to do so overseas, or to we're just going to start backing away from our advocacy. We talked this morning about the 3 policies, right? Are you going to when in Rome versus the embassy policy versus advocacy? And it's really easy to start backtracking when it becomes difficult. And that's on leadership. And we all have a voice here in our leaderships, in our organizations. So I think that's important. And I think when you talked about the Williams poll, about the polarization, I think we've seen examples of when we think, a rising tide lifts all boats, and maybe as we did November of 16, we thought that, things are looking good on a large scale. Well, you have to look at it regionally to understand what's going on at the local levels.
Yeah. And I think that a key best practice on this is if you're operating in a country, you should be connected to the advocates leading their movements in those countries to understand what is going on. I think there's great resources to getting connected to them. There are people in this room that work in global LGBTQ rights. There are great ways to show as a company that this is an issue that's important to you, not only having a non-discrimination policy that reaches your operations around the globe, but signing on to the UN business principles as someone who believes those are important, or someone that joins HRC's Global Business Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations or companies that are actually have the policy in place to prevent discrimination abroad and want to be public in their support of doing so around the globe. But being part of these mechanisms is important, but also just speaking to the folks who are leading these movements to understand what is the environment and how can we be helpful, and that has to really be done at the local level.
I want to open it up for questions if you have any, because I think you can see here you have a couple dynamos in this field who would have good advice for you if you have questions. Not to put too much pressure on you or on the audience, but I see a question back there.
Hi, Amanda.
How you doing?
My question is, what do you think the role that companies have or business have in encouraging their LGBT employees to engage more in the civic process, such as voting, or volunteer for some other government boards or some other oversight boards, be it here or be it overseas? And also, the second part of that question is, we also see that there are a lot more government-sanctioned violence happening, such as Hungary, Uganda. Somebody talked about that earlier. And what role do you think that businesses have, when all these violence are sanctioned by the government? And in India, for instance, they now actually rejected any foreign foundations to get money into their community-based organizations. So what can we do differently?
Two great questions.
Yeah, I'll thank you for the question. I'll take the first part. An organization, a corporation, and let's go right back to the business case, right? They want quality employees that they can draw upon. And over and over again, studies have shown that if you want quality employees, you have to have an open, progressive community, right? That embraces the values of your corporation, of your organization. And the way to do that is to have leaders in your government that indeed embrace those same values so that it can work its way into the sociological understanding to bring more high quality workers that your company can use. So any company that's not utilizing their workforce to go out and speak on behalf of why it's important to tell those stories of why it's critical to have that kind of openness in their community and to support those organizations, those leaders, the candidates, issues that come up on the ballot, I think is missing an opportunity, and certainly corporations should use their workforce to that end.
Todd, do you want to take the second one?
Sure. I think that it's a great question, and I think that there's a whole spectrum of things companies can do, and it really depends on the actual context where you are. But there are things like opening up your office so advocates have a safe place to meet. It's can be public in that you could speak out against something happens, but it could also be much more effective if a company weighs in privately about how this makes it hard for you to do business in this country, and how it makes it hard for you to bring in the best talent and the best employees and kind of have the most effective workplace when you're criminalizing our employees. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms. One of the places I wanted to really raise up here is Indonesia. I don't know how close people have been paying attention to Indonesia, but as I said earlier, there's a piece of legislation that got introduced earlier this year to criminalize same-sex sexual activity, which is against the trends globally of what is going on. This didn't come out of nowhere. Since 2016, there have been a consistent series of attacks against LGBTQ community members, verbal attacks from government leaders, verbal attacks from faith leaders, but also violent attacks where 150 gay men were rounded up by the police and paraded and outed in front of their whole community for being at a party together. Acts where a hair salon was raided by a vigilante group and trans women who were working in that hair salon were pulled out into the streets and their heads were shaved and then taken into the police by this vigilante group. Or there was two gay men who were imprisoned and then as punishment were flogged publicly in front of thousands of cheering spectators in that country. And it's a big business market in Indonesia. This is not good for the country and the business community in that country, and it creates this incredible opportunity for companies to reach out to advocates in Indonesia and say, how can we help? As well as how can we convey a message to the government that this is a bad business environment when this is happening?
Do you find businesses actually doing that, by the way? Are they doing enough of that?
They can always do more. I would say there is never going to be enough, and there's always more opportunity, but businesses have effectively engaged in pushing on public policy behind the scenes. And you brought up Uganda, and Uganda is an example where several businesses doing business in that country did not do it publicly, but definitely did weigh in about the backsliding legislation and legislative environment had happened there and why that was bad for their business. And so it can be helpful, and no doubt the business community carries a lot of power in influencing governments in many places, and it definitely is helpful to have that voice at the table.
I think of a recent, and I know you didn't bring it up, but we think about the Bahamas, right? Which has recently recriminalized homosexual activity. And what's their number one industry is hospitality and tourism. And many of those major hospitality companies are US companies. And so it's very important for them to step out and say, you're impacting our business. People are not coming or are canceling plans to visit the Bahamas, really close, because of the potential violence and crime.
It raises the question of whether those companies, hospitality companies, were a bit blindsided. I mean, how did they allow themselves to be put in that position where now they're lobbying to undo something? I mean, I don't know if you've
I can't say that I have that insight. I don't know.
Well, I think it goes back to the idea of wherever you're doing business, being connected to the local community because they for sure know what is happening and they are watching this and monitoring this. And it's just like our embassies across the globe. The United States asks our embassies to be sure that the human rights officer is sitting down with civil society leaders from the LGBT community so that they understand what is going on in each of those countries. And I think there's a bit of a model to that for corporations where there has to be a relationship built with civil society activists on the ground in places you're doing business because they're always going to be the people that best understand the environment. And they're the ones that can see what is coming down the road in a way that perhaps kind of your international affairs or government affairs person who is watching the country might not see and might not recognize the vulnerability it creates for you as an employer or as someone providing services in one of these countries.
In my old profession, we call that human.
Right.
Human intelligence, how to reach out to the community and find out what's going on.
And you have to have a corporate culture that encourages people feeding that information up as well, up the chain. I think we have a couple of people with questions. Let's try and get one there and one there. Okay.
I have a quick comment and a question for Amanda. First of all, as a former U.S. Marine, as a current CIA officer, and as an openly gay person, I want to thank you for raising awareness in the U.S. government. My question to you is how...
Appreciate it, and I guess it's Fleet Week, so we were out on the street, my wife and I, and there were Marines and sailors all over the place, and I was walking down congratulating them, thanking them all for their service, because it's really wonderful to see them in uniform.
Thank you very much. And I think you just answered my question to you is, how did you become involved in raising awareness and advocacy for LGBT issues?
For me, so you have to, go back into my origin story 20 years ago, which was I was coming out and there was no real model. There were no no model or no practices for me to follow, and so I made them up. You know, I got together with some other people that I knew in Tucson, Arizona, and we started crafting, you know, how do we do this? How do we become advocates? And I felt that while I may not have had a role model to follow, I wanted others to have someone that they could look at. So I blazed that trail. So I'm looking to pay forward for those who will come behind me, and the opportunity to serve you know, as a leader in our military was such an honor that was bestowed to me. You know, I really can't thank the past or the former president enough for that. So.
And we have another question already back there. And if there is time, if we can get him the mic, but I'm not sure if we will. We have a couple minutes.
Hi, just a comment on the pushback piece. I'm from Barbados, like I said earlier. But what we realize is when countries in the West move forward with LGBT rights, it definitely fuels the LGBT community within our communities. And what happens is that there's a pushback as a result. So it may seem like, you know, things are really going down, like you mentioned, but really and truly, when there's a flare up of work in the Western world, we get empowered in the community. You know, we know that these people are backing us and so on. And at the same time, there's a pushback. I think it will be remiss of us not to talk about colonialism. You mentioned India, you mentioned Uganda, and there's a theory that I talk about called homophobia as a form of resistance. So these Caribbean and sub-Saharan African nations feel like we want to so bad stamp our sovereignty and our independence as Caribbean and West African nations that we say, okay, well, we're going to push back because this is the one thing that we can do that stamps our values and so on. But our histories have been erased because of colonialism. And one thing that I always talk about is the term two-spirit. You know, that's indigenous to the Native American community. And in Barbados or in the Caribbean, in West Africa, that has been erased. So we don't know the origins of it. But of course, there have been LGBT people in the Caribbean and in sub-Saharan Africa for years. But because our histories have erased, the indigenous names have been erased. So the term LGBT we can admit that is a Western term, but it's just a term used to describe a certain sector of people. And we have erased that. And it's important to, like you said, work with civil society so that the movement comes from the bottom up. You know, and it has an indigenous and a local face to it. So people can't then say, oh, well, this isn't a Western import, but it certainly helps us as civil society, helps us push the movement forward. So I want to thank you for the work that you do, and it really fuels the communities and the civil societies there. But like I said, there's always that flare up that happens as a result.
Thank you. You pretty much wrote my closing remarks, but is there anything, last words you want to give to them?
Real quick, I think if we look back at history and we look what happened in South Africa with apartheid, I'm going to draw a real quick analogy here, is that there was an opportunity for corporations and businesses to stand up and do the right thing, and they waited and waited and waited until the government literally collapsed on its own. We have the opportunity for corporations to stand up today and to help out with the LGBT community around the world instead of waiting while people are being killed.
And that's also a reminder that there's another part of activism, which is investment activism.
Yes.
I mean, obviously that played a role in the 80s with apartheid as well.
Yeah.
Amanda and Ty, thank you so much.